So our special guest today is Jonathan Butcher. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Lovely to be here.
It's a pleasure. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in the horror genre.
I mean, I've loved horror from day one, basically. My parents aren't exactly horror fans, but I was allowed to read like true crime from a very young age, and I was obsessed with like the Ghostbusters and Nightmare and some sort of kid-friendly mangas and stuff like that. And I remember when I was 7 years old being banned from writing about monsters or ghosts for a whole term from one of my teachers. And I remember writing on the blocks at school there were like cement blocks around the grass while the kids were playing football. I would just be writing about zombies and stuff. So it's a lifelong thing for me, to be honest. I've only really been getting published for the last, I think 8 years now, something like that. But I've been trying to write novels all the way through my teens, and it's always been part of my life.
I've noticed you've got a new one coming out, a collection of stories.
That's right. That dropped just yesterday, in fact, without any warning whatsoever. I've been getting published through indie publishers for a little while, but my wife, who is also a horror author, as you know, only publishes herself. And I thought, well, I'll give that a bash. So yeah, this is the first time that I've ever published my own thing, longer than just 10,000 words. And I even created the cover for myself as well. And that's, it's called Something Very Wrong, which is a very gruesome but fun and rather extreme body horror collection of 9 stories with 3 brand new tales in it. 3 which have been published through the Evil Cookie in previous anthologies from them, and 3 others that are quite rare and not commonly seen. So yeah, that came out yesterday.
Yeah, I saw that somebody had posted a review on Facebook giving it a big thumbs up, so that's fantastic. Yeah,
that was Carrie. Carrie's awesome. So yeah, good start. Long may it continue.
Yeah, let's hope. So what's your process for developing a story? So where do you get your ideas from?
That very much depends on the story. I work quite well with prompts, which is why I've loved writing for K. Trap Jones's anthologies, as I just mentioned. They're always based around a theme. So the first one that I did was Bludgeon Tools, which was all tool-themed stories. And as long as it's quite a short piece, which those ones always are, 3,000 words, I'm just quite good at thinking of a slightly unique and odd way for me to use that prompt. But other things have come about through, life experiences. For some of my more serious stuff, like What Good Girls Do and What Good Men Do, I've never been mistreated, but unfortunately I've known people who have been, and they came from very angry places and needing to unleash a bit of psychic vengeance. Whereas the less serious ones, like Chocolate Man, have just been a long-running joke with my friends. So, they can come from anywhere, really. I've thankfully got to a point now where I've got loads of different stories that I'm looking forward to writing. So getting the ideas isn't the problem. It's just getting them out and publishing them.
Fantastic. So how do you go about creating compelling characters to your stories?
I think that characters are one of my strengths. I think I'm quite good at that. Probably because the first story that the first novel that I ever got published was very, very character-based. I love character-based writing. One of my favorite authors is Irvin Welsh, who wrote Trainspotting. And his book Filth, I think, is one of the greatest character studies for my tastes of the last sort of 20 or 30 years. I think that he lives and breathes his characters. And when I realized that, whenever that was, 10 years ago when I finished The Children at the Bottom of the Garden, I think, when I realized that you didn't just have to write a story as an observer, you can get inside the heads of your characters, whether you're writing in first person perspective and saying I did this and I did that, or third person and just talking about a character. I like to really try and imagine how people might authentically behave in those situations. I think the best sorts of stories come about directly from the characters. I don't like to usually write stories where people are just reacting to events out of their control. I like it when it's very much the characters' flaws and poor decisions that lead them towards these horrific situations, rather than just chucking them into a haunted house or somewhere filled with monsters or whatever. I just try to put myself in another character's shoes, whether it's a goodie or a baddie. They're both fun in different ways.
So are you a plotter or a pantser?
Initially, I'm a pantser, and then once I know where the story's heading, I become a plotter. So with Chocolate Man, for example, I kind of always knew that I was going to probably write a longer version. It started off with a short story based on my character Kreb, and I kind of thought I've got to write a full novel about this. And it started off just with a scene with a young boy in a house, and knowing that something dreadful has happened, but I didn't know what that was at that point. And gradually I just felt my way around the idea that this character had experienced something dreadful when they were young, and it's impacted everything. All of the characters around him, his whole family, are well aware of the trauma he's through. And I sort of felt my way in the dark. But then once I got maybe 2/3 of the way through, something like that, I thought, well, that scene doesn't belong. I'll delete that, get rid of that. And then knew exactly where I was heading and just wrote out brief summaries of what was going to happen in each of the chapters until I reached the end. I feel it's a little bit too restrictive to begin with, to just think to myself, I'm going to plot out every single scene and every single sequence, because sometimes my characters make decisions that I didn't realize they were going to make. And if I try to guide them too firmly, then I lose that, fluidity of the characters just being able to behave in the way that has become natural for them, that I hadn't realized before I'd really got to know them. That sounds really pretentious, but that's kind of how I feel about my characters. I do genuinely get to know them a bit.
So is there any sort of like themes or messages that you often explore in your work, or if you're not intentionally do it, they end up in there anyway?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. It kind of alters with the story. I think that what Good Girls Do has definitely got a message to it, though I wouldn't like to spell out exactly what that is, because I think it's open to interpretation. But what started off as a book, as I said before, when I was just trying to create a character who'd been so terribly mistreated and then was going to take revenge on all those who had hurt her. That was the original idea. And I thought, brilliant, I can just, I can hurt these awful, horrible people, and that'll be a really satisfying book to write. But as I wrote it, it became something I think more interesting than just a typical vengeance story. And I think, despite the fact, as I say, I've never really been through genuine trauma, I've lived quite a blessed life. I think it's really interesting to see how dreadful things change a person. We're all just the sum of all of our experiences, tied up with, some genetic, likelihoods and stuff like that. But generally speaking, everything that happens to us affects us in some way. And as a horror writer, I've definitely written about how trauma can shape a person in various different ways. I did the same in Chocolate Man, even though it was a much sillier story, and rather than about, sex, slavery and trafficking, which is a very heavy subject, this was about a poo monster. But I still, because I'm quite childish, but I still managed to make it, I think, to write it in a serious manner, even though there were silly sections in there, and it's a ridiculous idea at its core. It was still very much about how terrible events, can shape people and change them, and whether it's possible to, escape that cycle or not.
So what's been the hardest part of writing a book for you in the horror genre?
Originally, finishing one, genuinely. As I say, I've written stories since I was a kid, and throughout my teenage years, I tried to write and finish several books, but I was trying to write things that I just, wasn't mature enough or experienced enough to deal with in a convincing way, and I wasn't a good enough writer. So I think I tried to write one that was basically it, but written, by a 14-year-old British lad. Then I tried to write one about astral projection, and then I tried to write one about a drug addict, and all of them reached about 17,000 words, and then I realized I didn't know where it was going, and I'd lost interest. So The Children at the Bottom of the Garden is my longest novel, and I still think it's got some good writing in it. I would write it differently now, probably a shorter book, but it took 10 years to write that book because I wasn't able to find a story until then that interested me enough. The only way that I was able to finish that book was by thinking, right, what things entertain and amuse me, and what can I, keep myself interested enough to write about for an entire novel. It's a really ambitious book, actually, because there's like 6 or maybe even 7 main characters, and they each have their own separate chapters, each of which is written in their voice, essentially. So it's a big sprawling book. I would say that the biggest challenge that I've ever faced was finding a novel that was interesting enough to finish, really.
So what's been the most difficult scene that you've ever had to write?
Well, there's two ways that I can kind of answer that. One of them is the actual challenge of writing something because it's difficult, and I've just come out with a body horror collection, as I said, and I think that body horror, to write it well, is actually really, really difficult because you're describing absolutely impossible events, and you're not relying on like archetypal fictional monsters. You're not talking about a dragon. Like if I say dragon to you, you can picture a dragon. It might not be the dragon I picture, but you'll picture it. But if I, describe some scene of, distorting the human body in ways that it never has been before, I think it's really challenging to write about that in a way that's vivid enough for the reader to picture it. I can't really give an example of any of those scenes. Actually, no, a chocolate man. Okay. I was going to talk about ones in my most recent collection, but they'd all be quite spoilery. There is a scene in Chocolate Man where someone defecates out their entire skeleton. And if I say that, you might have some kind of cartoonish image in your brain. But when you think to yourself, right, I'm going to describe this absolute bizarre and horrendous image step by step and really break down the different stages of this horrendous thing, it's a real challenge. And I love that. So I would say body horror is really challenging to write. But then the other interpretation, there was a scene in What Good Men Do, the sequel to What Good Girls Do, that I knew was going to take place. And I was really dreading writing it because something absolutely awful happens to a character who I had grown quite fond of. And I'm not going to give spoilers for it because it's quite a pivotal scene. But I genuinely found it intimidating as I got closer and closer to it, because by that point I'd stopped the pantsing and I was doing the plotting part, and I knew that this sequence was coming up in a couple of chapters. Thankfully, when I came down to write it, I managed to write it in a way that I think avoided exploitation. I knew there was the chance that I might annoy people with it because it was a scene of sexual violence. I definitely find some scenes like that to be quite troubling, because I do find troubling subject matter to be really compelling and interesting to explore.
Yeah. Is there any sort of like subgenre that you wouldn't explore in horror?
Well, because it's too extreme, or because it sucks?
Because it may probably be, well, either. or because it's sort of like would be an emotional, how can I describe it, too much for you?
I don't think so, because I really dealt with that stuff head on in What Good Girls Do. As I say, I've never experienced it myself, but I've been very close to people who've experienced terrible things, and it definitely was a way of me working through the anger in that. And I don't think there is anything that's more troubling than writing about, child sexual slavery, essentially. So no, I've kind of done the absolute worst of it. So now, anything else is probably going to be a walk in the park.
Yeah, a lot of authors have said the same thing though, but they sort of write out what they've traumatized in their life as a way of trying to deal with it, and there's a little bit of therapy. So it's I think it's a good way of doing it.
I think so too. I think horror allows us to face those terrible events in a safe way, or a relatively safe way. Because I know that people can be triggered by certain things, and if you have been through terrible experiences, then you definitely need to be careful with the sort of subject matter that you read. But I think for a lot of people, I've had messages from people saying that they agree with this. It's a way of coping and safely facing those fears and those triggers. Yeah.
So have you had any memorable feedback from readers that have made an impact on you, good or bad?
Well, the first 7 lines of What Good Girls Do made someone sick in their mouth, made another person cry, and this one I saw firsthand, ruined someone's entire day. So obviously that isn't the aim of a book, but to know that I'd written just 7 lines that could have such a profound impact on people, as a horror writer, you don't really get better feedback than that. You made me sick in about 10 seconds. Brilliant.
Whatever, what all horror authors want.
I mean, I've had lovely things said other than that, but those ones definitely spring to mind when you ask me that question.
So have you got any exciting projects that you're currently working on that you can share?
I have one very exciting project I'm working on that I can't share, unfortunately. But hopefully there will be the announcement pretty damn soon for that. In other stuff, I'm really hoping to finish a book that I have struggled with for years. And I started back in 2018 or maybe 2017 or something, called Beast of the Earth. Which, if I had pursued the way I was going to write it before, it's about extremism and terrorism, essentially. But it's like a horror novel about that. If I pursued it in the way before, I could be accused of all sorts of things, and I don't think I'm a good enough writer to tackle the subject in quite the same way. So I think I've found the way to unlock this story, and I'm going to attempt for the first time NaNoWriMo. I'm going to try and finish an entire draft, even if it's rubbish, in just a month. So even though I've got this other project on the boil, that's the next thing that I'm going to do. And I'm also, in a very different way, really excited to finish a book that I have plotted out, even though I said I'm generally a pantser, and written 20,000 words for. I just did a master's degree, and this was my final project. I had to do the first 20,000 words of a crime fiction book. And this is called, I don't really like this title yet, but it's called The Path Reader. And it's about a psychic escort.
Right.
So, yeah, my character, Kane Kingshot, is able to read people's pasts and futures while he is having sexual contact with them. And he's become a bit of a local celebrity as a result of this, because it's the first time anyone has ever really been able to prove that they actually have psychic abilities. And he attracts the attention of some very shady people, and becomes embroiled in a disappearance case that involves the local gangland.
Sounds intriguing.
So yeah, lots going on, lots of things that I'm looking forward to writing and getting out there.
It's fantastic. So where can people find your books, Jonathan?
Amazon and Godless. I haven't released my most recent collection through Godless just because I'm going to see how it does using Kindle Unlimited, which people can sign up for. But godless.com and Amazon are the two main places you can find my work.
That's fantastic. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on the show, so thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Crystal. That's brilliant.
You're very welcome.